They said he was cruel. Every night from the rundown cabin at the edge of the snowy woods, people heard the barking, the weak, hoarse cries of a starving golden retriever. Neighbors shook their heads. That old man, always yelling, always pulling on the chain. Through the icy window, they caught glimpses. Alvin Brooks, scowling, yanking the trembling dog by its collar, his voice harsh in the cold night. The poor creature, thin as a skeleton, cowered in the snow, its golden fur caked with mud and ice. "Why keep a dog if you're going to treat it like that?" they whispered. "He should be locked up himself." But no one dared knock. No one wanted to face the old man with the cold eyes. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. And if you believe no soul should be left to freeze alone, hit that subscribe button. This story, it will shatter what you think you know. The wind screamed through the pine trees, shaking loose brittle branches that fell with sharp cracks onto the snow-laden ground. Vermont's winter had wrapped the village in a blanket of white, and as night crept in, the sky turned a heavy gray, promising more snow before dawn. The cold was sharp enough to bite at skin, to seep through boots, to rattle teeth. Along the last stretch of road, where the clustered houses gave way to wild forest, stood a crooked old cabin with a sagging roof, chimney leaning like a drunk. In that cabin lived Alvin Brooks, 70 years old, a man swallowed by years and silence. His body had shrunk over time, his shoulders hunched forward as though trying to fold himself small. His hair was a wild thatch of white, sticking out in tufts no matter how he ran his hand through it. And his face was lined deep from sun, wind, and too many bitter winters. Alvin's beard covered his jaw in a wiry mess, stained yellow where an old tobacco habit clung on. But it was his eyes that unsettled the villagers, sharp, pale blue, darting nervously when anyone passed, narrowing into suspicion if someone dared speak his name. Once, long ago, Alvin had been known as a skilled carpenter, a man who crafted tables, chairs, and cabinets for half the town. But time had taken his family. First his wife, who died in her sleep, and then his only son, who left for the city and never came back. After that, Alvin had folded into himself, stopped talking to the townsfolk, stopped coming to town except to buy the barest necessities. Now, he lived off a tiny government check, holed up at the edge of the woods where no one wanted to go. The townspeople whispered about Alvin. They called him the old madman, the hermit, the ghost at the edge of town. Children dared each other to walk past his cabin at night, squealing with laughter when they thought they saw his pale face at the window. Adults shook their heads and muttered, "Poor soul, but strange. Best leave him be." But then came the sound of barking. Thin, weak, hoarse. Night after night, drifting from the little yard outside Alvin's cabin, there came the cries of a dog. Not just any dog, a golden retriever puppy, no more than 7 months old, its ribs pressing against its patchy coat, fur matted with mud and ice, chained to a stake in the frozen yard. The villagers saw it as they passed by, the old man yanking the chain, shouting, dragging the trembling creature across the snow. "He shouldn't have a dog if he can't care for it," one woman said sharply in the bakery. "He's cruel," another man added, shaking his head, blowing into his gloved hands. "The poor thing'll freeze to death," a third murmured as they passed the edge of the woods, catching sight of the old man shouting at the little animal, his voice echoing off the trees. No one dared approach the cabin. They crossed the street when they neared it, walking faster, eyes flicking to the darkened windows, to the battered old porch. Some whispered that Alvin had lost his mind, that he talked to himself at night, that he raged at the dog when no one was watching. Others said the dog must have wandered into his yard, and now he wouldn't let it go. The snow began falling harder that evening, thick flakes blurring the outlines of trees and houses, muffling the sound of footsteps. Alvin came stumbling out of the cabin, coat threadbare, boots cracked and patched over too many times. His breath came out in harsh clouds as he dragged the thin chain behind him. At the end of the chain, the golden retriever puppy stumbled after him, its legs shaky, head drooping low. Its golden fur was dirty, tangled, dotted with small ice clumps. Its wide brown eyes flicked around helplessly, its body thin enough that the bones showed along its hips and spine. The dog shivered violently, a soft whimper escaping its throat as it tried to follow the old man's jerky movements. Alvin yanked the chain hard, grumbling curses under his breath. His face twisted in a scowl, eyes darting toward the woods, toward the road. He gave another sharp tug, pulling the puppy roughly toward a wooden crate lined with old, dirty blankets. The dog stumbled, fell into the snow, let out a soft yelp. Alvin snapped something, his voice raw and angry, and shoved the dog into the crate, slamming the lid down. From the road, a group of villagers passing by slowed, exchanging uneasy glances. A woman clutched her coat tighter, whispering, "He's hurting it. I swear, he's hurting it." A man beside her frowned, his face shadowed under his cap. "Why doesn't someone stop him?" "I heard he threatened the last person who came near," another said, voice low. They hurried on, heads down, the sound of the dog's faint cries following them as they disappeared into the falling snow. Inside, Alvin sat alone at his kitchen table, head bowed into his hands. The air was cold, his breath misting faintly as he sat motionless, eyes squeezed shut. His fingers twitched slightly, and his shoulders gave a small, involuntary shudder. From outside came another soft, broken whimper. Alvin's head jerked up sharply. For a long moment, he simply sat, fists clenched, staring at the door. His mouth tightened. His jaw worked silently. Then, slowly he stood, his bones creaking, his breath wheezing out in small bursts. He took a step forward. His hand twitched toward the door, but he stopped. His eyes closed briefly. His shoulders sagged, and he turned away, shuffling back to the cold chair by the window. And outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing the world in white silence, burying the whispers, the cries, and the old man's muttered curses under layer after layer of winter's cruel hush. The morning after the snowstorm, the village awoke under a thick white silence. Roads were buried, chimneys puffed thin trails of smoke, and the trees sparkled with a cruel beauty under the pale winter sun. On the edge of the woods, Alvin Brooks's cabin sat half swallowed by the snowdrifts, its sagging roof now topped with a thick, heavy crown of ice. Claire Hudson, 29, pulled her woolen hat tighter over her wavy auburn hair as she hurried down the main street. She was of average height, slender, but with a quiet, determined energy in her step. Her fair skin was flushed pink from the cold, and her green eyes, usually soft and thoughtful, were today sharp with worry. Claire worked at the village bookstore, a quiet place she loved, surrounded by the smell of paper and old wood. She was known in town as gentle, a bit shy, someone who fed the stray cats behind the shop and set out seed for the wintering birds. But today, she felt a knot of unease that wouldn't leave her chest. The night before, while walking home from visiting her elderly neighbor, she had passed Alvin's cabin. She'd seen him under the porch light, dragging the thin puppy across the frozen yard, his voice rough and angry, the puppy's small body flopping helplessly. Claire had frozen in place, heart pounding. It wasn't the first time she'd heard rumors about Alvin Brooks, but seeing it with her own eyes, it rattled her. Inside the bookstore that morning, Claire fidgeted behind the counter, ringing up a few customers but barely noticing their faces. Finally, she slipped out her phone and called the sheriff's office. Sheriff Sam Porter, 52, was a solidly built man with broad shoulders and a square jaw, his brown hair now streaked with gray at the temples. His face was lined, more from years of worry than age, and his dark eyes had a sharp measuring quality that missed little. Sam had been sheriff in the village for nearly 20 years, steady and even-tempered, but marked by the scars of a divorce 10 years earlier that had left him more private, less quick to trust. When Claire's call came in, Sam was at his desk, reading through paperwork with a heavy sigh. Claire's soft, anxious voice on the line stirred him to attention. "Alvin Brooks? You're sure you saw him mistreating a dog?" he asked, scratching at the stubble on his jaw. "I saw him pulling the dog hard, shouting at it. It looks so thin, Sheriff. I think he's hurting it." Sam exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. "All right, Claire. I'll go by and check. But you know how Alvin is. He doesn't like visitors." Claire chewed her lip. "Please, just make sure the dog's okay." That afternoon, Sam climbed into his old green truck and headed toward the woods. The snowplows hadn't cleared the side roads yet, so he had to crunch carefully over thick ice patches. He parked near Alvin's cabin, stepping out into the biting wind, his heavy boots sinking into the snow. From the edge of the yard, Sam could see the puppy in its crate, shivering, eyes wide and dark, its ribs stark against its thin body. He sighed. Claire wasn't wrong. The dog looked in bad shape. He climbed the creaking steps and rapped his gloved fist against the door. Inside, he heard a scraping noise, the shuffle of feet. Then the door cracked open a few inches. Alvin's pale, sharp eyes glared through the gap. His breath smelled faintly of old tobacco, his wild white hair sticking out in disarray. "What do you want, Sam?" he rasped, his voice a gravelly growl. "Got a few reports, Alvin," Sam said calmly. "People are worried about the dog. Can I take a look?" Alvin's lip curled. "It's none of your business, Sheriff. Get off my porch." Sam's jaw tightened, but he stayed patient. "Alvin, people are talking. Just let me take a quick look, okay? Make this easier for both of us." But Alvin shoved the door closed sharply, the lock clicking into place. Sam stood there for a moment, exhaling a long plume of breath into the cold air. He looked back at the small crate in the yard, the puppy's dark eyes staring out miserably. Back in town, Claire sat at her kitchen table, nervously refreshing her social media feed. She hadn't meant to share the shaky video she'd taken the night before, but after talking to Sam, her worry had gotten the better of her. Now, the video was spreading, gathering dozens of comments. "Someone needs to save that dog." "Why hasn't the sheriff done anything yet?" "That old man's always been a menace." Claire's stomach twisted. She didn't want this to turn into a mob. She just wanted to help. But it was already too late. The rumors were flying faster than she could stop them. By evening, a group of villagers had gathered at the edge of the woods. They stood in small clusters, their breath fogging in the cold, watching the dark shape of Alvin's cabin. Some held up their phones, trying to catch a glimpse through the snow. Claire arrived, heart pounding, clutching her coat tight. She spotted Sheriff Sam standing near his truck, arms folded, jaw tight. "Sam?" she asked softly. He turned, his eyes weary. "He wouldn't let me in. But I can't just break down the door without cause." Claire glanced at the crowd. "They're scared. They think he's dangerous." Sam's gaze flicked back to the house. "He's stubborn, not dangerous, but people believe what they want to believe." As night fell, the wind picked up, carrying the faint, thin cries of the puppy across the snow. The villagers shivered, hugging themselves, muttering in uneasy tones. Inside the cabin, Alvin sat alone, his head in his hands, the faint lamplight casting long shadows on the peeling walls. Outside, the puppy let out one more soft, broken whimper. And in the growing darkness, the small town held its breath, waiting, watching, as the weight of suspicion settled heavy over the cabin at the edge of the woods. The night was a living thing, howling, thrashing, clawing at the world with icy fingers. Snow came down in thick sheets, blinding, swallowing up the narrow Vermont roads and burying every rooftop under a heavy white blanket. The old cabin at the forest's edge barely held against the weight, its sagging beams groaning, its cracked chimney coughing pale smoke into the storm. Inside, Alvin Brooks sat hunched in a dark corner, his wiry body shivering beneath a threadbare blanket. Alvin's life had once been a simple, proud one. He'd worked with his hands, shaping wood, building cribs, tables, cabinets, things meant to last. But that was decades ago, before life had worn him down to skin and bone. His wife, Anna, had been the warmth of the home, a woman with soft red hair, gentle hands, and the voice of a church singer. She died in her sleep 20 years ago, a quiet passing that left Alvin shattered. His son, Matthew, full of dreams and restlessness, had left not long after, driving west with promises of letters that never came. Since then, Alvin had drifted through each day like a man underwater, suffocating slowly, silently. His house had crumbled around him, his tools had rusted, and the world had simply moved on. The government check barely kept him in bread and canned soup, and the townspeople, once his neighbors, once his friends, crossed the street when they saw him. Over time, Alvin had let the bitterness harden in his chest, and his muttering, his angry shouts were more often aimed at himself than anyone else. Tonight, those shouts echoed off the wooden walls. Alvin crouched near the cold hearth, rocking slightly, the blanket wrapped around himself and the small, shaking body of the golden retriever puppy in his lap. His pale blue eyes were wet and wild, and his cracked lips trembled as he rasped into the dark. "Useless old man, stupid, worthless, can't even save a damn dog." He ran a trembling hand over Rusty's thin, matted fur. The puppy let out a faint, pitiful whimper, its dark eyes half closed, breath shallow. Alvin's chest tightened painfully. He had found the pup 2 weeks ago, left to die near the woods. At first, he had thought to walk away. It wasn't his problem, after all. But when he heard the weak, gasping whine, something inside him cracked. He'd carried the pup home, wrapped it in an old blanket, whispered useless promises that he would fix everything. But he couldn't. He couldn't afford vet care, could barely buy food for himself. And every time Rusty grew weaker, every time the little dog tried to stand and collapsed, Alvin's anger boiled over. Not at the pup, but at himself. He would pace the room, fists clenched, shouting at the walls, at the ceiling, at the memory of his own failures. To the neighbors outside, it sounded like rage at the dog, but the truth was far sadder. Alvin was a man cursing the mirror, punishing himself for a lifetime of losing everything that mattered. Outside, the storm beat harder against the cabin walls. At that same moment, Claire Hudson pushed through the heavy snow, her wool coat soaked through, her breath coming in sharp, icy bursts. Beside her, Sheriff Sam Porter trudged forward, shoulders hunched against the wind, his thick gloves clutching a flashlight that barely cut through the storm. Claire's heart pounded with fear and urgency. She had never been the brave type. She was gentle, quiet, someone who preferred the company of books and cats to conflict. But tonight, she couldn't sit and do nothing. She kept seeing the puppy's shivering body, hearing Alvin's shouts, imagining the worst. Sheriff Sam, beside her, kept his expression grim. The scar on his left thumb throbbed with cold, a reminder of the accident years ago when a beam collapsed at a construction site, crushing his hand and ending his old career. He knew what it was like to carry around old wounds, to be marked by things you couldn't fix. They reached the cabin, the windows dark, the door rattling slightly in its frame. Claire raised a trembling hand to knock, but Sam gently pulled her back. "Let me," he said, voice low. He pounded on the door with his gloved fist. "Alvin, it's Sheriff Porter. Open up." No answer. "Alvin, we just want to check on you." Still silence. Sam exchanged a glance with Claire, then stepped back and gave the door a hard kick. The old wood splintered, the door swinging open with a creak. Inside, the cold hit them like a wall. The hearth was dark, the air damp and frigid, and there, near the dead fireplace, they saw him. Alvin Brooks, hunched on the floor, blanket wrapped around himself and Rusty. His face was buried in the puppy's fur, his thin shoulders shaking with quiet, broken sobs. Claire's heart clenched painfully. She stepped forward, voice soft. "Alvin?" The old man didn't look up. His voice rasped out, hoarse and cracked. "I couldn't save him. I couldn't save anything." Sam knelt beside him, his steady hands resting lightly on Alvin's shaking back. "Alvin, we're here to help, but you need to let us." Alvin's pale eyes finally lifted, red-rimmed and wet. His cracked lips trembled. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I tried. I couldn't." Claire gently reached out, her gloved hand brushing over the puppy's fragile body. Rusty gave a faint twitch, a tiny sigh, his dark eyes fluttering weakly open. Claire felt tears sting her eyes. "You're not alone anymore, Alvin," she whispered. "We're going to help you, and we're going to help him." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside that small broken cabin, the bitter, icy night was pierced, just faintly, by a spark of warmth. The morning after the storm dawned bitterly cold but bright, sunlight glinting off fields of undisturbed snow. The village of Maple Hollow stirred slowly, smoke curling from chimneys, children bundled in scarves, their laughter ringing faintly across the frosted streets. But at the edge of the woods, where Alvin Brooks's cabin sat battered and half-buried, the light seemed to fall heavier, as if weighed down by years of shadow. Inside the cabin, Alvin sat stiffly in a creaking wooden chair, the patched blanket still wrapped tight around his shoulders. His pale, lined face was turned toward the hearth, where a small fire, built by Sheriff Sam, crackled weakly. In his lap, Rusty lay motionless, except for the faint rise and fall of his thin chest. His golden fur tangled, dirty, and clinging to his bony frame. Alvin's hands trembled slightly as they rested on the puppy's side. His eyes, pale blue and watery, flickered up only when the door creaked open. Claire Hudson stepped carefully into the room, her slender figure dwarfed by the bulky winter coat she'd hurriedly thrown on. Her auburn hair was still damp from the snow, curling against her pale cheeks. Behind her came a new figure, Dr. Isaac Miller, the village's only veterinarian. Isaac was in his late 30s, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a kind face marked by faint lines at the corners of his eyes. His short-cropped dark blonde hair poked out from beneath a wool beanie, and a neatly trimmed beard framed his mouth, giving him a rugged but approachable look. Isaac had grown up in Maple Hollow, left to study animal medicine in the city, and then, after a messy divorce that left him hollowed and restless, had returned home 5 years ago. He was known for his patience, his soft voice, and his way of crouching low to meet even the most skittish animal eye to eye. Claire's voice was gentle but urgent. "Alvin, this is Dr. Miller. He's here to help Rusty." Alvin stiffened, his thin fingers curling reflexively over the dog. His voice cracked, a hoarse rasp. "I don't need charity." Isaac crouched beside the chair, his dark eyes calm. "It's not charity, Mr. Brooks. It's care." His hands moved slowly, carefully, as he reached out toward Rusty, whose ears twitched faintly at the new voice. "Let me look at him, okay?" Alvin's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. Slowly, hesitantly, he shifted Rusty into Isaac's arms. Claire knelt beside them, her hands clasped tightly in front of her chest, her heart pounding as she watched. Isaac worked quietly, his gloved hands moving deftly over Rusty's frail body, checking his paws, his belly, his eyes. He murmured softly under his breath, a habit he'd picked up during long emergency shifts at the city clinic, as much to soothe himself as the animal. "He's underweight, dehydrated, the leg's been injured for a while. It's not fresh, but it's bad." Isaac glanced up, his eyes kind but serious. "We'll need to get some fluids in him. Soft food, warmth. With time, he has a chance." Claire let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Alvin sat frozen, staring down at his empty hands, as if he couldn't quite believe the small, broken life had been lifted from them. His voice trembled when he spoke. "I found him in the woods. 2 weeks ago. Someone left him there. Just a bundle of bones and shivers. I couldn't leave him." His pale eyes shimmered wetly, his voice a whisper. "I've lost everything else." Claire reached out, her gloved hand resting lightly on Alvin's bony arm. "You haven't lost him." Outside, the village was waking up, word spreading fast. From the bakery, Mrs. Edith Lane, a plump woman in her 60s with sharp eyes but a surprisingly soft heart, sent over a basket of fresh bread. From the grocers, Tom and Diane Bell, a middle-aged couple always seen bickering but united in their love for animals, arrived with bags of dog food and blankets. Even Mason Parker, the teenage boy who usually loitered at the gas station, sheepishly brought over a battered old dog bed from his garage. At first, Alvin bristled, his bony shoulders drawing up, his lips pressing tight. Years of isolation had taught him to expect nothing but cold shoulders and wary glances from these people. But as the afternoon passed and his small cabin filled with quiet voices, warm hands, and gentle smiles, something inside him loosened, just slightly. He watched Claire gently unpacking supplies, Isaac checking Rusty's vitals again, Sam hauling in firewood without a word. For the first time in what felt like forever, Alvin felt the press of human presence around him, not as an intrusion, but as a lifeline. As evening fell and the cabin filled with the soft glow of lantern light, Alvin sat back in his chair, the blanket still around his shoulders, watching Rusty curl into a newly donated blanket by the fire. His mind drifted unbidden to the past, to the night of the fire 30 years ago, when a faulty heater had reduced his small family home to ash, taking Anna and little Matthew with it. He had clawed through the wreckage that night, skin burned, lungs raw from smoke, but found nothing left to save. After that, he had built walls around his heart, his home, his life, until only bitterness remained. But Rusty had been a crack in those walls, a tiny, golden crack. Claire, noticing his distant stare, sat beside him quietly. "You're not alone, Alvin." Alvin's throat worked as he swallowed hard, his pale eyes shimmering. "He's all I've got." Claire smiled softly. "And you're all he's got." Outside, the cold wind rattled the trees, but inside, the little cabin glowed, a fragile warmth blooming where only cold had lived for so long. Night crept back across Maple Hollow like a silent thief. dragging behind it the icy breath of winter. The snow, freshly fallen, gleamed silver under the pale moonlight, the bare trees casting jagged shadows across the ground. Alvin Brooks sat by the cabin window, his old, bony fingers trembling slightly as he pulled the tattered blanket tighter around his shoulders. His pale blue eyes, sharp despite his years, flicked nervously toward the dark line of the woods. Rusty lay curled on a nest of blankets by the fire, his small body still fragile, but his breathing steadier now, thanks to Isaac's care. The puppy's golden fur, though still matted and dirty, gleamed faintly in the firelight. His dark eyes blinked sleepily, his ears twitching at every crack or snap outside. Alvin felt his chest tighten. He'd spent years alone in this cabin, braving storms, loneliness, and hunger, but something about Rusty's presence had reawakened an ancient instinct in him, the need to protect. Outside, the snow had muffled the world, but Alvin's sharp ears caught a faint sound, the soft crunch of paws, the low huff of breath. His stomach knotted. Slowly he rose from his chair and crept to the window, careful not to cast a shadow. There, at the edge of the yard, just beyond the battered old fence, a pair of yellow eyes gleamed in the darkness. A wolf. It was a large one, its gray coat dusted with snow, ribs faintly showing through the lean frame. Winter had been hard on the wild creatures, driving them closer to human homes, drawn by the promise of easy prey. Alvin's heart pounded painfully in his chest. He knew enough about the woods to understand the danger, especially with the scent of a wounded animal lingering around his cabin. Alvin pulled back from the window, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His old body trembled, not just from age, but from the rush of panic he hadn't felt in years. What could he do? He had no gun, no traps, nothing but a rusty hatchet by the door and the shaky strength left in his bones. A knock at the door startled him so sharply he nearly fell. He shuffled quickly to answer, pulling the door open just enough to reveal Claire Hudson's worried face. Her auburn hair was pulled into a messy braid, snowflakes clinging to her coat and scarf. "Claire," Alvin rasped. Claire's cheeks were pink from the cold, her green eyes wide with concern. "I came to bring you more food and some medicine for Rusty." She held up a paper bag, her gloved hands trembling slightly. "But the roads are getting bad. The news says another storm's rolling in. I think I need to stay in town tonight." Alvin's face softened slightly, the deep grooves at the corners of his mouth relaxing. He had never imagined, not even a week ago, that anyone would come to his door with kindness, let alone someone like Claire, gentle and determined. He reached out, his gnarled fingers brushing hers as he took the bag. "Thank you, Claire," he murmured. Claire gave him a faint smile. "You'll be all right tonight?" Alvin hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the window, then back to her. He didn't want to alarm her, didn't want to sound like a paranoid old man. But the memory of those glowing yellow eyes haunted him. "There's a wolf," he whispered, voice rough, "out by the fence." Claire's eyes widened, the color draining slightly from her face. "A wolf?" Alvin nodded slowly. "Drawn by Rusty's scent, I think." Claire swallowed hard, her hand gripping the doorframe. "I'll tell Sheriff Sam before I head back. Please, Alvin, stay inside, lock the doors." Alvin managed a small nod. "I will." Claire hesitated, then reached out, placing her hand lightly on Alvin's thin arm. "You're not alone, Alvin. Not anymore." The old man gave a hoarse chuckle, one corner of his mouth lifting. "Feels strange to hear that." With one last glance, Claire turned and hurried off into the snowy night, her figure quickly swallowed by the darkness. Alvin watched until she vanished, then closed the door firmly, sliding the bolt into place. He moved carefully through the cabin, checking the windows, pushing old chairs and crates up against the doors. He dug out the rusty hatchet and laid it on the table beside his chair. Rusty stirred on the blanket, his dark eyes blinking open, a faint whimper escaping his throat. Alvin sank down beside him, his stiff knees protesting, and laid a trembling hand on the puppy's back. "I won't let anything happen to you," he murmured, his voice cracking. "I swear it." Rusty let out a soft sigh, his tiny body pressing closer to Alvin's side. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the branches against the cabin walls. Somewhere far off, Alvin thought he heard a low howl, the sound carrying faintly through the storm. His old heart thudded heavily in his chest. But he stayed where he was, one hand on Rusty's trembling form, the other clutching the blanket tighter around them both. And so, through the long, cold night, the old man and the small, battered dog huddled together by the fire, waiting, listening, as the storm raged on and the shadows prowled just beyond the edge of the light. The night dragged on in a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the old cabin's beams or the faint rustle of snow sliding off the sagging roof. Alvin Brooks sat slumped against the wall, one trembling hand resting over Rusty's thin, sleeping body. His eyes, pale and rimmed with exhaustion, darted toward the window every few minutes, his breath shallow, his old heart thumping with a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not exactly, but something more primal, a protective edge he thought long dead. The wind howled through the trees, making the cabin's walls shudder, shaking loose flecks of old plaster. Outside, the snowstorm continued to rage, but Alvin's sharp ears caught something different now. A soft crunching, not the wind, not the shifting drifts, but deliberate. Pause. His chest tightened as he forced himself upright, gripping the edge of the wooden table for support. His legs ached, his back twinged with pain, but his eyes were alert. The rusty hatchet lay by the door, but even as his hand hovered near it, Alvin knew the truth. His strength had left him long ago. He shuffled over to the window, heart hammering. And there, slipping through the half-light of the snow-covered yard, the wolf came into view. It was larger up close, gray and white, ribs showing faintly under a shaggy coat, its breath misting in ragged puffs as it sniffed the snow. Its eyes gleamed faintly red in the moonlight, narrow and hungry, the gaze of a creature driven to the edge. Alvin's blood ran cold. Suddenly there was a loud crack. The rotted wood of the fence gave way, collapsing under the wolf's weight as it lunged forward. Alvin stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. He grabbed the hatchet, but his gnarled hands shook too hard to grip it properly. He shoved a chair against the door, knowing it wouldn't hold. Then came the shuddering slam. The door rattled violently as the wolf crashed against it, its claws scraping, its snarl a guttural, rasping sound that cut through the cabin like a blade. Alvin backed up, hands shaking, eyes darting desperately around the small room. Rusty stirred weakly on his blanket, letting out a faint, questioning whine. Alvin's chest heaved. "No, no, no," he whispered, dropping the useless hatchet. He clutched the nearest thing, an old wooden cane propped by the chair. He could hear the doorframe splintering, hear the labored huffing breaths of the starving animal outside. Then, with a sickening crash, the door gave way. The wolf surged into the cabin, snow and cold blasting in with it, its eyes blazing, fangs bared, saliva dripping from its jaws. Alvin raised the cane with a hoarse cry, but his body betrayed him. His arms shook, his knees buckled, and he fell backward with a painful grunt. The wolf advanced, its gaze locked on the shivering, whimpering bundle near the fire. Alvin's heart seized as he saw Rusty struggle to lift his head, the puppy's dark eyes wide and dazed. "No!" Alvin rasped, trying to push himself up. But before the wolf could take another step, something unbelievable happened. With a burst of raw, desperate energy, Rusty let out a thin, high-pitched bark, a sound full of terror and defiance. The puppy lurched to its feet, his injured leg trembling, his small body visibly shaking. And then, against all reason, Rusty lunged forward, throwing himself at the wolf's throat. The two bodies collided with a snarl and a yelp, the wolf jerking its head in surprise as the small golden blur sank tiny teeth into its neck. For a split second, the wolf faltered, distracted by the sudden, furious attack. Alvin, eyes wide with shock and horror, forced himself upright, grabbing the cane with both hands. Summoning every ounce of fading strength, Alvin staggered forward and brought the cane down with a hoarse shout, striking the wolf's side. Once, twice, a third time. The wolf snarled, twisting violently, throwing Rusty off with a brutal shake of its head. The little dog hit the floor hard, letting out a sharp, pained cry. Alvin raised the cane again, slamming it down with a raw, wordless cry of rage. The wolf, panting and bleeding from small cuts, let out a furious snarl, but finally backed away. With one last glare, it turned and fled through the broken door, disappearing into the snowy night. For a long moment, Alvin stood frozen, chest heaving, cane trembling in his hands. The wind howled through the shattered doorway, biting at his skin, but he didn't feel it. His eyes, pale and wide, were locked on the crumpled form near the fire. "Rusty," he whispered, voice cracking. He stumbled forward, falling to his knees beside the little dog. Rusty's golden fur was matted with snow and dirt, his small body shuddering faintly. Alvin's hands trembled as he reached out, gathering the puppy into his arms, cradling him against his chest. "No! No! No!" Alvin's voice broke into a strangled sob. "Please, Rusty! Please, you brave little fool!" The puppy stirred faintly, his dark eyes fluttering open, his small tongue giving a weak flick across Alvin's hand. Alvin let out a choked breath, tears spilling down his lined cheeks, his thin body curling protectively around the tiny, trembling life in his arms. He pressed his forehead against Rusty's cold fur, rocking slightly, whispering broken words. "You saved me. You saved me, little one." Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing the yard, the broken fence, and the dark forest beyond. Inside the cabin, Alvin sat in the glow of the dying fire, his arms wrapped tightly around Rusty, his tears soaking the puppy's fur as the old man clung to the one fragile, precious light left in his world. The first rays of dawn crept slowly across the snow-laden village, casting a pale pink glow over the rooftops and hills. The storm had passed, leaving behind a cold, brittle silence. Frost sparkled on every surface, the world holding its breath in the wake of the night's fury. At the edge of Maple Hollow, where the forest met the village, the old cabin stood still, its door hanging askew, the yard a mess of broken fence posts and scattered snow. Claire Hudson hurried down the path, boots crunching in the hard-packed snow, her breath puffing white in the freezing air. She hadn't slept. As soon as the first word reached town, that Alvin's cabin had been attacked by a wolf, she'd bolted from her apartment, not even bothering to braid back her auburn hair, which now whipped loose around her flushed face. Her green eyes were wide, darting anxiously ahead, her heart pounding. Behind her came Sheriff Sam Porter, his thick coat zipped to his chin, his square jaw set, gray-streaked hair pressed down under a wool cap. His dark eyes, usually measured and calm, were sharp with urgency. Sam had been the one to gather the villagers, calling for help before first light. Now, a small crowd followed him. Isaac Miller, the veterinarian, carrying a black bag slung over his shoulder, his tall, broad figure moving briskly despite the cold. Mrs. Edith Lane from the bakery, her round figure bundled in layers of scarves, a worried frown on her usually sharp face. Mason Parker, the lanky teenager who'd brought the old dog bed days before, now walking awkwardly, hands stuffed deep in his pockets. As they neared the cabin, they slowed. Claire felt her breath hitch. In the middle of the yard, kneeling in the snow, was Alvin Brooks. The old man's frail body was hunched, his thin, bony shoulders trembling under the weight of a worn blanket draped over him. His wild white hair stood in stark contrast to the dark, wet patches on his cheeks, tracks of tears frozen by the cold. In his arms, cradled as carefully as if it were the most precious thing on earth, lay Rusty. The little golden retriever's body was limp, his soft golden fur damp with melted snow, small paws curled gently inward. Alvin's gnarled hands trembled as they stroked the puppy's side, his pale blue eyes clouded with moisture. His cracked lips moved silently, whispering words meant only for the tiny life in his arms. Claire let out a soft sob, a hand flying to her mouth. Sam laid a firm hand on her shoulder, grounding her, but even his own eyes shimmered faintly in the cold light. Isaac moved forward cautiously, his breath visible in the morning air, but stopped short as Alvin's thin voice broke the silence. "Thank you, Rusty." Alvin's voice was hoarse, raw with grief, every word trembling. "You saved an old, useless man. You saved me." His hands cupped Rusty's small, still face, thumbs stroking gently along the puppy's soft ears. Claire sank slowly to her knees in the snow, tears slipping freely down her cheeks. One by one, the villagers followed, the small crowd forming a circle around the old man and his fallen companion. Mason knelt awkwardly, his hands twisting nervously in his lap. Edith wiped her eyes with a handkerchief, her plump face crumpling. Even Sam, who rarely let emotion break through his weathered expression, stood quietly, jaw clenched, his chest tight. No one spoke. They all watched, breath held, as Alvin bent his head low, his forehead pressing gently to Rusty's. His shoulders shook faintly, his tears falling onto the puppy's fur, soaking into the golden strands. His voice was barely a whisper now, a fragile thread in the still morning air. "You were my light, little one, my little light in the dark." Isaac stepped forward cautiously, kneeling beside Alvin. His rough hands were gentle as they reached out, resting lightly on Alvin's trembling arm. "Alvin," he murmured softly, "let me take him inside. We'll do this together." Alvin blinked slowly, his red-rimmed eyes lifting to meet Isaac's. For a long, still moment, he simply stared, lost, hollowed. Then, slowly, painfully, he nodded. Isaac eased the small, lifeless body from Alvin's arms, cradling Rusty with surprising tenderness for a man with such large, calloused hands. Claire moved forward quickly, helping Alvin rise, steadying his frail form as his knees threatened to buckle. His hands clutched at her sleeve, the old man swaying slightly, his eyes never leaving Rusty as Isaac carried the puppy gently toward the cabin. Inside, the fire was rebuilt, blankets warmed, tea brewed. Claire stayed close, her small hand resting on Alvin's bony shoulder. Feeling the faint tremors that ran through his body, Sam moved about quietly, coordinating the villagers, making sure the broken door was secured, the smashed fence noted for later repair. Edith, usually brisk and no-nonsense, moved with surprising gentleness, setting a plate of fresh bread near Alvin's chair without saying a word. By late morning, the little cabin was filled not with grief alone, but with something else: community. A warmth, fragile but real, began to take root in the old walls, and in the days that followed, the story spread. The tale of the mad old man at the edge of the woods transformed. No longer was Alvin Brooks a figure of suspicion or fear. He became something else, a symbol, a reminder. Parents told their children about the brave little dog who had saved the lonely old man. Teenagers who had once sneered now walked past the cabin in quiet respect. Claire visited often, bringing food and books. Sam checked in regularly, making sure the cabin stayed warm, the repairs held. Isaac, in his calm, patient way, became not just a veterinarian, but a friend, sitting with Alvin in long silences that needed no words. And Alvin himself? He changed too. Slowly, cautiously, like an old door creaking open after decades rusted shut, he let the world back in. He tended the grave Isaac helped him dig under the big oak tree, planting a small wooden marker there. He kept a soft blanket folded by the hearth, his old hands resting on it sometimes, eyes distant, but no longer filled only with sorrow. The legend of Alvin and Rusty became part of Maple Hollow's winter stories, a reminder whispered from parent to child that even the coldest heart, the loneliest soul, can be set ablaze by the love of a small, determined creature. In the quiet snow of Maple Hollow, something extraordinary unfolded. Not the kind of miracle that splits the sky or parts the seas, but the everyday kind, the kind that whispers. A broken old man, a fragile puppy, and a village that once turned away but found itself gathered together under one dawn sky. Maybe, just maybe, Rusty was more than just a dog. Maybe he was the little messenger God sent, not with grand words or heavenly light, but with soft paws and fierce loyalty. A reminder that no one, no matter how forgotten, is truly alone. That in our darkest moments, love can break through, sometimes in the smallest, furriest form. So, today as you go about your life, remember, look around. Who needs your kindness? Who is shivering alone, just waiting for someone to notice? Because maybe you're someone's miracle. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Comment below where you're watching from. We want to hear your stories, your prayers, your miracles. And if you believe in the power of love, in the quiet work of God's hand moving through even the simplest creatures, subscribe to this channel to help us spread more stories like this. May God bless you, keep you warm, and remind you that you are never forgotten.